Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Are you bored with writing scripts to move data into SaaS tools like Salesforce, Marketo, or Facebook ads? HighTouch is the easiest way to sync data into the platforms that your business teams rely on. The data you're looking for is already in your data warehouse and BI tools. Connect your warehouse to HighTouch, paste a SQL query, and use their visual mapper to specify how data should appear in your SaaS systems. No more scripts, just SQL. Supercharge your business teams with customer data using HighTouch for reverse ETL today. Get started for free at dataengineeringpodcast.com/HighTouch. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Pardhu, Gunnam, and Mars Lan about Metaphor Data, a platform aiming to be the system of record for your data ecosystem. So Pardhu, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, Tobias. Nice to be back on your podcast. I am Pardhu. I am a CEO and co-founder of Metaphor Data. I've been in the data platforms for the last decade. I started with AWS resource optimization for EC2 and data visualization, then eventually worked on metric store, what we call as like unified metrics platform at LinkedIn. And eventually from there, my interest moved towards metadata, which is a very related space, and joined the metadata team at LinkedIn and being like engineering manager, growing the team along with Mars for the 2 years. And now extending the space, working on metadata for feels like a lifetime now.
And Mars, how about yourself?
Hi, Mars. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Metaphor. Like Pardhu mentioned, we sort of went back at LinkedIn. I actually have a slightly different background. I didn't start with a traditional data background. I was at Google working on Google Cloud. It's early days of Google Cloud, so more like an infra sort of type of roles. And then recruited into LinkedIn to lead a metadata team as the tech lead. And spent about 3, almost 4 years over there solving various interesting metadata related problems before we came out and started Metaphor.
Going back to you, Pardhu, you mentioned that you spent some time also on the dedicated metrics store, and I know that that's an area that's been seeing a lot of activity and attention lately. I'm curious what your sort of brief take is on the state of that ecosystem in terms of the Transform folks and Supergrain and Metricool and probably many others that I don't even know about yet.
It's a very interesting aspect. Like I'm always like proud about like being the founding engineer working on it like 5 years or 6 years ago at LinkedIn. The whole thing started with the data democratization, right? Like, hey, how do you define and like enable data consumers like data scientists and data analysts to directly define and create new data sets or metrics? So it depends upon the view. Like a lot of companies approach this problem by defining YAML files or some kind of JSON configurations of like defining metrics and like translating them into actual data pipelines to generate those on regular time. Like this is essentially what like LinkedIn did as part of unified metrics platform, which we worked for quite a long time. And interesting aspect you mentioned about the metric store for us is DBT, right? So you must have been following recently. DBT also like went into creation of metrics, which is a very natural path in my opinion. Now you have defined your pipelines and configurations through DBT. Now next step is to define and like specify a particular view, which is really a metric on top of these tables.
And so for folks who want to learn more about how you both got into data and some of your background there, I'll refer them back to the previous interview that you were both on, and I'll add links to the show notes for that. But that brings us to what you're building now at Metaphor. And I'm wondering if you can just start by giving a bit of an overview about what it is that you are building there and some of the story behind how you decided to turn that into a business and some of the motivation that keeps you interested and excited in spending your time and effort on that.
So as we kind of alluded previously, there's definitely a big LinkedIn heritage story going on here, but I think it's very relevant. So I'll sort of briefly talk about it as well. So when I first joined LinkedIn, I was leading the metadata team. This is a very new team at the time, actually. And the problem they're trying to tackle was mostly how do we free up the data engineering team to work on things that are more data engineering oriented than trying to sort of handhold their stakeholder, essentially data science, business analysts and whatnot, to find the thing that they need. So that was kind of the initial search and discovery bent of the metadata. But by the time I joined, the focus quickly shifted onto GDPR, obviously because GDPR at the time was a huge deal for all these consumer internet companies. What sort of triggered that is hey, you guys, your team is the only team that actually have visibility into what LinkedIn has in terms of the data ecosystem. So naturally, that's the very first step to do compliance, because you kind of need to know what you have before you decide what to do with them. So naturally, the team sort of start building out the entire infrastructure for enforcing GDPR-related issue, compliance-related issues. And that is the time when sort of it hit us and say, hey, look, the stuff that we gather for search and discovery, it turns out that a big chunk of it is very, very relevant for compliance. And then the light bulb went on in our heads and said, hey, maybe we should build this as a platform rather than building it as a point solution for individual use cases. We literally started from the ground up building a good metadata platform. We often joke about that. We build a kind of crappy product, but sit on top of a very solid metadata platform, because there's a huge use case of, hey, we have pipelines and system that needs to grab the metadata and do actions in real time. So you need to have that sort of ability to scale your platform. And then our intuition was actually right after GDPR, there's many other use cases started popping up along the same similar line. Hey, you guys have 80% of the metadata. Can we just bring in another additional 20% and then our problem will be solved at that point? So quickly, it started from, like I said, the search and discovery morph into GDPR, and then start moving into data governance. This is actually one thing that Pardhu didn't mention when he talked about the UMP platform. It was so successful in a short period of time, having, I forgot what's the exact number, 30,000 or 60,000 metrics? 30,000 metrics, right? So there's no way a company will have 30,000 metrics, right? The reason behind that is because there isn't any governance around it. So quickly, you end up having duplicated metrics or metrics that are significantly similar to each other, but not leveraging each other at all in any sense. So the platform quickly got into this data governance piece as well. How do we make sure that we have a way of growing our data ecosystem, allowing people to freely self-serve and democratize, but it's not a complete organic growth that has no control whatsoever. So data governance is kind of the next area we got in. And also, we also got in parallel, got into the whole AI, ML, DevOps. LinkedIn at the time was pushing an initiative called ProML, which is productive machine learning. So they want to have all these infra pieces that help the machine learning practitioner to be very productive in their machine learning process. And then metadata was a big part of it as well. They need to be able to find the feature that they're looking for. They need to find the model they're looking for. They need to know what state they're in. They need to know which ones are good, which ones are bad, and which one are deployed to prod, which ones roll back, et cetera, et cetera. So the same platform actually also powered that particular use cases. So at that time, we realized, hey, look, something that we built is actually very interesting, because it kind of became the center of the universe where a lot of other use cases can sort of just branch out from there. And we also realized, hey, this is probably, and of course, at the time, we also open source the platform as data outside and gain significant traction. Actually, in fact, I believe it is still the number one open source project out there in this area. So that is the time when we start realizing, hey, this thing that we build probably has a lot of value outside of LinkedIn. Even though we build a specific LinkedIn, we can see that other companies also have similar problem. And so that's when we decided, hey, we should come out and solve this problem for other companies as well. And we feel like we're in a unique position because we've been through all these things and seeing what work and what not, and decide we can really in a good position to build a product that can solve problem for many other companies. So that's kind of the genesis of the company. That's why we decided to leave LinkedIn and start on our own.
One of the things that's notable is that on the landing page, when you first go to the Metaphor Data website, is that it claims that you're trying to be the system of record for the data platform. And it differs a little bit from the data catalog nomenclature that a lot of people have been hearing about recently. And I'm wondering if you can just unpack that statement and how you settled on that particular phrasing and what that means in terms of the actual capabilities of the platform and how it might differ from how people think about data catalogs as a product category.
So this is very interesting, right? Like if you observe, like in the last one decade, like or even earlier, like a lot of the industry work has been put into breaking the silos in data, right? And pulling in all the data into either data lakes or data warehouses and enabling multiple analytics and predictions and everything on top of that. So a similar trend also is we have observed on metadata. So there is a lot of silos within the metadata between these ecosystems, and there is a lot of value we have noticed by which we can create by breaking these silos between the data systems. So without that, we have observed that all the data applications try to interact and grab metadata from each other, creating n square connections between each other to share and exchange this metadata. And with that comes a lot of problems around, hey, did both of us read similar set of metadata, or what point of in time, how did it evolve? Everyone has to solve similar set of problems of consistency or version control and everything within this metadata exchanges as well. So we saw that that's a good parallel between the actual data ecosystem problems and the metadata ecosystem problems, right? And what we envision as by calling as a system of record is essentially hey, is a platform, a metadata platform, which can actually group on all these metadata into a single place and provide a consistent view of the metadata for all the, both people consumption and as well as the system consumption for the metadata. And you're absolutely right. A lot of our competition and a lot of the existing products and view it and name it as a data catalog, which is one of the applications which we believe is one of the applications for this aggregated metadata, right? And traditionally, it also came from the notion that data catalogs are a solution for data discovery, or to be more specific, technical data catalogs are a solution for data discovery, which we believed in as well for a long time. To be honest, it was not sufficient or it did not work well, right? So that's why we strongly believe being the system of record, by being a good metadata platform, aggregating this would solve the problem holistically across multiple use cases without requiring us to build very point-to-point solutions, right? Data catalog is one point solution, and next time you want to handle metadata change management, something, you build a different application, or you want to solve resource optimization, you build a different application. A lot of these things have good overlap, which you can leverage through a metadata platform. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And it also puts me in mind of the work that is happening at the Open Metadata project of trying to be this universal substrate for metadata in a data ecosystem, and that the metadata is just the foundational building block for all of these different views and applications to be built on top of it, of which the data catalog is just one. And others are things like data quality, data governance, lineage tracking, things like that. I'm wondering if you have spent any time looking at the work that they're doing there as far as their approach to metadata as this universal substrate, and any lessons that you either have been able to learn from that, or some of the maybe points of difference in terms of the philosophy of how you think about metadata as this substrate from how they're approaching it, of this very well-defined, schematized model.
I think the goal is very similar. And, in fact, I believe the Open Metadata team has a wealth of experience and data as well. And that's why they saw these coming, so to speak, right? They didn't choose to build a point solution. They choose to build a platform. We kind of joke about Open Data is a better version of Data Hub to some extent, mostly because Data Hub is subjected to some of the technological choices that LinkedIn sort of place limits on, right? So, and Open Metadata being a brand new thing, they have a lot of freedom in choosing what to do there. So yeah, I think the ideas are very, very similar. In terms of metadata modeling, actually, in fact, the two are very, including us as well, right? We're all very similar in this sense. The idea is you want to be strongly schematized, but not to the extent where you essentially become the least common denominator. Because if you think about it, obviously the most extendable data model will be a dictionary. You can just put key value pair in there. You can extend it all day long you want. But of course, that will be completely useless when someone's using it, because you basically say, I'm essentially schemaless. You go and figure out what's in there. So the user is going to have a bad day using your completely extendable metadata platform, right? So, but on the other extreme, if you are, really trying to be very, very specific about things, right? You say, hey, look, I have a very strong opinion about this thing, about that, and all that, which is great for your user because your users know exactly what to expect there. But then you're not going to be able to capture all the rich metadata, right? Because systems are bound to differ, right? And if you just try to slot everything, right, put your square peg into round holes every time, then you end up having a round peg, right? So you have the least common denominator in that sense. So how do you have a strongly schematized system and also at the same time very extendable? It's in and of itself, it's a very interesting engineering challenge. It's a challenge in the sense because the entire stack had to go with this model. It had to evolve with this model as it evolves, right? Not just your storage, your API layers, even your UI kind of have to, automatically updates as you update your model. That itself is an interesting challenge. It's just the challenge that we had at Data Hub and we're trying to solve inside of LinkedIn to some extent. And we are still solving it today. I don't think anyone's got a perfect solution yet. But there's a couple of good choices that was made there in open metadata versus Data Hub versus what we're doing. For example, Data Hub is using Pegasus, which is like a very weird language that's developed at LinkedIn. And, even though it's open source, it's not super popular outside of LinkedIn. Metadata chose JSON schema, which is a very well understood schema language, standardized, and also has a strong connection to Open API as well. And that is also the path that we've chosen, right? We want to choose a language that people are fairly familiar with, have a lot of strong support in terms of community and tooling and all that, and being able to evolve based off that.
In terms of the target users for Metaphor, I guess, where are you focusing your primary efforts as you're launching the product, and how does that inform the features that you're building and the user experiences that you're designing to be able to go to market with it and help to provide value to people who are starting to onboard onto the Metaphor platform?
So this is a very interesting aspect, right? Like, so often comes up a question like, hey, are we building it for data engineering team, or are we building a tool for data, like the rest of the company or the business analyst or like the business users? Like the answer is for both, right? Like there is so much of overlap of like requirements and like what use cases, what can be solved for both of the people. It almost warrants that like you need like a common tool which can solve in this common, like in a single place, which for both sets of the users, right? So we see it as three different personas, to be more specific. One is the data producer or like data engineering team or data analytics engineer persona, right? Like who is actually creating and pipelines or like maintaining the pipelines or creating very specific core assets for rest of the company to like consume. One of the most common goals for these teams is data democratization, enabling like data creation, like and consumption across the company. But data democratization is great, but like it also kind of led to a lot of data sprawling, right? Like often we end up with like very small companies with like thousands of dashboards and thousands of like tables. Imagine like one is, you have like a lot of resources spent across these dashboards and like assets, but any migration or any change which they have to make is a nightmare to manage, right? Like the small data team, which is data producer team, which is our engineering team, which is supporting a huge company with like 1 to like hundreds of customers is very daunting. Being these common central team of data, they often become also like a bottleneck or like common resource to kind of ask any data related questions, right? Which is sometimes they do have knowledge, like sometimes they're not even the right people to kind of answer those things. So they end up being routing people for like, hey, maybe this is created by that particular group. Can you go and like talk to them why they did it? Like, why did they pull this particular column and things like that, right? And this is essentially like a lot of support for being the data team and like enabling the data stack rather than like solving core engineering problems around data, right? Like that is what their actual main aspect of the job. So this is one problem like persona which we try to help with and solve through Metaphor. Second persona is data consumer. Like if you see the same problem from like other side, right? Like, hey, the company is moving extremely for a data adoption and like data democratization, but like I'm able to create, but like also end up with like a lot of questions around like trusting the data, right? Like I see too many copies or like I see too much of similar data, like which is the right one to use and when should I use what? Like sometimes the answer could be multiple. Sometimes the answer could be not the popular choice and like very specific to your use case. So how do you bring that knowledge and how do you get those questions answered without what we call tap on the shoulder, like asking too many people, hey, is this the right one? Or like, which one should I use through Slacks or through emails and things, right? So that is second set of problems which we see for data consumer's perspective, data consumer persona, or the typical business analyst and data analyst personas. Third and interesting persona is like actually data leadership. So yeah, you have a team who is creating, enabling data democratization. You have like in that company, you have stakeholders who are creating data sets and stuff. But often like this too many data sets and too many metrics, dashboards created like a lot of inconsistency, right? Which is eventual problem for like organic growth and like scale, right? Like, so you have like inconsistent answers coming from like multiple places, or you don't know if you're getting the right ROI out of your data resources, right? Like ROI doesn't mean just like the cost of like Snowflake bill or anything else. Like even in terms of you end up with like a lot of resources, like any migration. Is it wise for my team to even spend time migrating this one when actually there are no end users down the dashboards? There are dashboards which are pulling the data, but no one is actually using it. So what's the impact? Like, so helping them understand what's the right ROI, what's reducing the opportunity cost of like maintaining all these unnecessary data across the system. And like tell you, this all ties into like a lot of productivity for your data team and like your company as well. So these are the three personas which we focus on as part of the metaphor, and like especially the teams which are very modern data stack users are like our main focus for metaphor right now.
Digging into the actual technical implementation of what you're building at Metaphor, I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the architecture, how you approached the design and implementation of it, and some of the lessons that you've learned, both positive and negative, from the work that you did previously at DataHub.
I think I sort of touched on that briefly in the open metadata conversation there a little bit, but in a nutshell, the architecture actually largely resemble what we built at LinkedIn, DataHub. But it's completely written from the ground up, right? In fact, it's not even written in the same language as it was originally written. So that's how different it is. But like I mentioned before, our goal is to build a platform on top of which you can build additional stuff, right? So it's like any good platform, there will be a bunch of requirements against it. And in fact, by the time this podcast gets published, we would have probably published our technical blog post on that sort of details, talk about this in greater details about our architecture and our platform piece and how that was built and so on. Redirect your audience to that to read more on that. But here I'll just roughly touch on a couple of points which are important for a metadata platform. First of all, it's like any platform. It has to be scalable, right? The reason behind that is a lot of people overlook the scale of thinking that, hey, metadata is small, right? I can easily fit that into a PostgreSQL or something like that. Yes, that is if you're looking at a subset of the metadata, right? When you're actually looking at the holistically all the metadata generated in your ecosystem, it adds up very, very quickly. Right? Imagine you're trying to capture every version of schema, every columns in your tables, every lineage, right? Every changes made to the system, every job that runs, and so on and so forth. Very quickly, that sort of thing will build up very quickly. So your system has to be scalable in order to cope with that sort of growth. And actually, one sort of fundamental decision we've taken fairly early on is we want to make sure that every metadata capture is immutable. In the sense that everything that comes into the system becomes a version of itself, right? You don't go back and change the history per se, which means we have to actually retain everything over time, right? And of course, we're very smart about not retaining versions that are identical, right? You make sure that only real changes get captured per se. But still, it can add up very, very quickly. So when you have that sort of scale, your system need to be capable of handling that. And it cannot just be, like I said, a lot of time when people build point solution, they'll choose the technology that's most appropriate for that. And a lot of time, if you're thinking only about data catalog, sure, Postgres will probably do just fine in that sense. But when you're thinking about something that need to enable all sorts of different application on top, scalability, it becomes a big issue, right? And then the second thing is reliability. Once again, right, kind of given any platform need to be reliable. But the reason why it need to be reliable is if you only have human accessing your metadata, sure, I mean, it can go down, right? I mean, it's only 9 to 5 during the weekday, right? You don't need to have 4 nines, 5 nines, 10 nines uptime, right? But as soon as you have system that's depending on this metadata, right? Which has, in the case when we have at LinkedIn, we have pipeline literally that wakes up every night and then read the metadata and delete stuff, right? Because it's GDPR compliance and whatnot. You need to have a very reliable system because if you don't, some other system will go down with you. So that's the second point. It has to be very reliable. The third point is we sort of touch on the extensibility, right? This is also a little bit different from traditional platform. A traditional platform will say, hey, look, I have my API. My API is kind of set in stone. And then if I need to make any changes, it's going to be V2 API, right, and V3 API at that point. Here, it's actually very different because the actual metadata we want to try to capture evolve, and we want to try to capture as rich metadata as possible. So the API is almost constantly in flux, almost in that sense. How do you make sure that it's extendable in that way and without breaking your clients, so to speak? That's also another challenge from a platform perspective. And then finally, first-class APIs, right? This is also super important. We talk about this a little bit, right? You kind of expect, yes, as a platform, you need to have RESTful API, right? That's almost a given today. But for metadata platform, you need more than just a RESTful API. First of all, metadata is very, very powerful because it's connected, right? A lot of things are related to a lot of things. So if lineage will be one of those variation where, assets connected to some other assets and so on and so forth. But if you think beyond that, how are people related to these assets, right? And how are additional stuff, for example, jobs that ran that created this and all that. So all of these things, it forms this complex metadata graph. And a lot of time when you're trying to answer your specific use cases, questions and whatnot, you're literally just traversing this graph, right? So traditional RESTful API is not very ideal for that sort of traversal. You want a more graph-like API that allows you. So maybe GraphQL or maybe some other graph language that are more suitable for these sort of graph-oriented query. So you need that sort of graph-oriented API. And also on top of that, you also need a lot of time you want to enable use cases that are sort of reactive, right? Okay, something changed, some system should wake up and then do something. For example, if all of a sudden a data set, drops 100,000 columns, something should happen, right? Maybe an alert should go off. Or maybe this thing became out of compliance, right? Someone accidentally not supposed to access it. Something should happen. So that sort of thing, you don't want the client to busy poll your API trying to see whether something changed, right? You want to get notified essentially. So kind of like a push-based system, push-based API. And it's kind of expected off a metadata platform as well. And finally, there's also an analytical API. Normally just means, hey, I want to be able to make sure that this data is available to run complex analytical query en masse, right? So give me all the data set that fits criteria ABC that was used in the past 3 days and used by this group of people and, blah, 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 etc. You can think of that sort of very complicated analytical use cases. You don't necessarily want to run that against your transactional database, right? Because that's why we developed data warehouse in the first place. So similarly, you want to be able to open up those API that allow people to run that sort of query against it. So that is kind of in a nutshell talking about the platform and sort of the requirements, unique requirements you place on the platform. In terms of architecture, we essentially build this whole thing based off the best cloud could offer, right? Which was one of the main reasons why we wrote this whole thing, because there's a lot of great cloud technology out there, and nobody, really, you don't need to invent your own key value store that's globally distributed and all that sort of stuff. It's already done, and you can really just leverage those and build a much more reliable system that way. So yeah, that's kind of how it is. Hopefully that covers it. But once again, I'll say hopefully by the time that you listen to get to this podcast, the blog post is out. So read the blog post for more details. Hopefully I'll do a much better job explaining it there than here.
In terms of the sort of engineering work of actually getting this off the ground, you mentioned that you started the business about a year ago. And so as everyone knows, this is in the middle of the pandemic. So I'm sure that added some additional challenges. But in terms of actually getting things up and running, what have been some of the most complex or complicated engineering aspects of building this all out from scratch, and some of the new edge cases that you discovered in the brand new implementation, and some of the new features that you wanted to bring in to be able to support the customers of the business?
Sure. I talk a little bit on the engineering side of challenge, and I'll let Pardhu talk a little bit on the business side as well. So we started out with a team with initially the core developed, the initial founding engineer of Data Hub, right? These are the folks that think they have done that for so many years. They've seen how the system evolved and all that. So they have a fairly good idea about what needs to be done. But yes, there is a sort of a learning curve from us coming from LinkedIn, which is not really a cloud native company, into this cloud native space and try to build things based on what the cloud could offer. There's a bit of learning curve there. But in terms of what needs to be done, is actually reasonably straightforward. And we actually knew exactly what the problem that we hit at LinkedIn in terms of Data Hub. And we joke about, we know where the skeleton is in the closet. So it's exciting in that sense. We feel like, hey, look, we knew we'd done something great, but we could definitely do better because we know where the problem is. So we'll go and address those problems. So that's kind of the initial engineering challenge. And of course, like doing this in pandemic is the team aspect of how do you build a team, a globally distributed team in this sort of challenging environment. I think that applies to everybody, literally, not just us.
Just go beyond building the team, which is a totally remote situation, which we have not experienced before. That's a common problem. But also interesting aspects around product, the expectations from the market around data catalogs. And one thing which was a different assumption for us was we thought we need to do a lot of education around why such problem exists and why you need to build a solution for that. But market rather surprised us. There is so much inbound that happened with an interest in data catalog or data discovery, and to be more specific, because I think all the companies which have enabled the DBTs or the Lookers and the Snowflakes and Databricks, the data democratization has really accelerated the problem to much smaller companies as well. That was a pleasant surprise for us. Even a company with 100 people team with a very small data team have similar challenges compared to a 500 or 1,000 people team, which was our original. That's an interesting change in dynamics in terms of the go to market and things like that.
Yeah. Struggling with broken pipelines, stale dashboards, missing data? If this resonates with you, you're not alone. Data engineers struggling with unreliable data need look no further than Monte Carlo, the world's first end-to-end, fully automated data observability platform. In the same way that application performance monitoring ensures reliable software and keeps application downtime at bay, Monte Carlo solves the costly problem of broken data pipelines. Monte Carlo monitors and alerts for data issues across your data warehouses, data lakes, ETL, and business intelligence, reducing time to detection and resolution from weeks or days to just minutes. Start trusting your data with Monte Carlo today. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Monte Carlo to learn more. The first 10 people to request a personalized product tour will receive an exclusive Monte Carlo swag box. And so another interesting element of the ecosystem that you're building this in and around is the, recent huge amount of focus that has been put on the idea of the modern data stack and what that might actually mean in terms of technology choice or design philosophy or technical capabilities. And I'm wondering how that sort of general focus on the modern data stack as the preferred way of building out a data platform has influenced the way that you think about building Metaphor and how you think about the way that Metaphor works in the situation where maybe there isn't this monolithic cloud data warehouse that the entire organization has used as a focal point for all of their data flows, and just some of the expectations that people have going into using Metaphor, whether or not they are actually using this sort of canonical stack, whatever form that might take.
It's actually a very interesting question that you brought up. I think the whole modern data stack, of course, the definition of that can be a little bit blurry, but that's assumed that means, hey, look, we want to take advantage of all these, best in breed product that solve our data problem. So instead of relying on kind of a monolithic, solution offered by one vendor that, yes, takes you end to end, but, you sort of get locked into them and also you sort of don't get the best in breed on everything. There's now a lot of these SaaS services, cloud data warehouse obviously being one of the main ones out there, but allows you to easily, as a one-man or one-woman, two-person data team to quickly bring up your data stack to reach the same sort of sophistication as maybe the biggest enterprise out there, right? With a few button clicks. I think that in and of itself is wonderful. And then I think what Pardhu mentioned previously, when we thought, hey, look, these data problems might only affect the bigger companies out there. The reason why we start seeing them in smaller companies was mostly because of the modern data stack that attribute to that, because now people are sort of being empowered, given superpower, if you will, right? Where these things only used to belong to large enterprises and biggest companies out there. So I think to a great extent, this trend will probably carry forward. I think obviously vendor will want to dominate and monopolize everything up and down the stack. But the reality of it is people probably prefer best in breed is easy to get their hands on, right? But then the problem there is, first of all, interpolation between these systems, right? Because obviously vendors generally don't have a strong interest trying to work with each other, especially if they're competitive. So the interpolation between different systems is going to be a challenge, a constant challenge. And second of all is, we sort of touched on quite a bit before, is this whole governance piece as well, right? Now, yes, you give people superpower. Guess what? They're going to do a lot of things. That's what's not going to happen. You make it super easy to create things and then literally free to create them. Guess what? People will just keep creating more of it. So that is definitely where we see Metaphor can come in and help. And then I think we're in a unique position to come in and help, is to first of all give you this visibility across your entire landscape, across these multiple SaaS systems that you're using and, best in breed product that you're using, give you that holistic view, because let's face it, nobody else will do it other than a company that specializes in this area. So we'll give you that view, but not just that, but also help you to make sure that you grow your data ecosystem in a scalable way. Not just how much more data you can put into it, but how do you make sure that it's maintainable over long term. So we do feel like that is the true essence of, modern data stack. You give people the power, you truly democratize them. At the same time, you make sure there's guardrail in place as well, so people don't fall off the cliff, right? So view ourselves as being that guardrail to make sure that people don't just shoot themselves in the foot by going all in organic growth.
I think one of the interesting elements of the idea of the modern data stack is that everyone assumes that means that you're using this, Snowflake or Redshift or what have you. And so all of the data that you're working with is this tabular textual data. But as we all know, if you're doing anything beyond the sort of simplest level of data workflows, you're also going to be dealing with unstructured data or data that lives in object stores or machine learning models. And I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the ways that Metaphor and the underlying data model that it allows for gives you the opportunity to have this more holistic view of data that lives beyond the bounds of that single data warehouse and the other types of data assets that you might be working with.
Absolutely. I think you're touching on something really important as well. So when we talk about how we model things, right, we're trying to be as generic as possible, because who knows, tomorrow there might be a new system XYZ that was invented that has a very different characteristic than what you have today. But we have these sort of high level concept that is sort of portable across. For example, we view whether it's a table or maybe it's Parquet file that lives on your data lake, we all view them as quote unquote data set, right? So that's kind of a homogeneous concept of, hey, it's highly related data, right? Generally the same schema, sometimes doesn't have to be even, but conceptually it's the same schema for a particular bunch of data that is considered as a data set. But beyond data set, you're absolutely right. The value of having a metadata platform is to have all these other entities that are related to data set, which is, sure, it's kind of the center of the universe from a data science perspective. But there's many other things that many other people uses, right? Of course, it's going to be dashboard. Of course, it's going to be machine learning model. Of course, it's going to be feature. Of course, it's going to be higher level concept. For example, DBT, right? What is a DBT model anyway, right? Probably it's a table, but it doesn't have to be, right? Actually, you can choose whether you want to materialize into a table or not, right? So that sort of stuff has to be all captured in these sort of entity relationship graph, if you will. So when people start looking at it, they can truly understand how things are related. And that, once again, sort of echoing back what we mentioned before, right? When you go down that path, then every entity that you talk about in your entity graph will have a bunch of different kind of very rich metadata attributes, if you will, right? Because depending on whether it's a Redshift table, it might have partition key or whatever. And when you have, if it's unstructured data, well, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff related to that as well. So you need to have the basic anchoring entities in your system and say, hey, look, that's how we conceptually think about these things. But that doesn't mean that this thing can only take one form. Right? It can take a lot of different forms, but conceptually they are considered as a data set. It's just like different version of data set, almost like an object-oriented sort of way of thinking, but less rigid, right? It's not like, okay, you have to have this class and that class, extend that. More like, hey, the famous saying in software engineering, right? Composition over inheritance, right? Do you want to be able to do composition rather than this strict inheritance sort of system? So that's how we look at it. And in fact, we actually model people as an entity in there as well, because we really think people is a very critical part of the system. Who's using what, who produce what, who's a subject matter expert of what, who's in charge of this and all that sort of information, you have to have it as part of your ecosystem, because guess what? When people are dealing with this thing, They want to talk to a person. They don't want to talk to a machine. Right? They want to be able to find the right person to talk to and ask for help and whatnot. So people is absolutely another entity that is sort of in the graph as well.
In terms of the actual people aspects of the metadata system, one of the interesting layers that you've built in for Metaphor is this integration with the communication systems that an organization might use, where you can use it to either query your metadata graph from Slack or be able to pull in conversations that have happened in these different platforms and attach that to a particular set of data assets. And I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the capabilities that you're building there and some of the types of workflows that you envision as you were building out those capabilities and some of the kind of details around how that manifests.
This is a very interesting topic, right? Like one of our customers famously quoted, like the best data catalog is the one which you really don't have to go to, which if you see, what does it mean? Like really the whole essence around data catalog is a web UI, and like you need to go there and like start your data workflow or like understand which data, or like even to include search and discovery or any use cases, right? Like a lot of our competition, or a lot of, like in our past, we have done like the similar approach. And as we start thinking more and more about metadata as a platform and like metadata applications embedded in like all data products, we focused a lot more on embedded workflows. So what does this mean? Like, take an example of like Slack, which is one of the most common communication channel across all our customers and can represent like other tools as well, right? Similar tools. I would argue that it's actually Slack these days an essential data product. The reason being, like a lot of conversations around data between all the folks in the company actually happen in the Slack. A lot of decisions, information get exchanged, a lot of knowledge gets around data gets built into the Slack, right? So that's why we essentially believed in our users should be able to kind of consume and like create anything or like interact with the data within the Slack itself as an embedded workflow, rather than explicitly logging into our web UI or like interacting with our web UI explicitly. So example would be like you are conversing with someone in the data team or your colleague about a data set, or through a Metaphor Slack app, you can really search for any data assets and things within the Slack and like share it right away there. And also conversely, when you think that you have exchanged like some important information about this data asset, be it a dashboard or things, with a click of a button, you can push that knowledge to your data catalog or data platform and persist there, so that like it's available for rest of the people and rest of the ecosystem as well. So these are like some cool new features which we built inside through a powerful Slack app, not just like simple notifications and tagging the conversations, etc. Yeah.
In terms of the overall workflow of actually onboarding onto Metaphor, integrating the communication systems, the data systems, populating the data lineage graph, I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the ways that you have designed the product to simplify that, maybe any specific client libraries that you've built to ease the integration process from the technical layer, and just the overall workflow of deciding Metaphor is the platform that I want to use. Now I've got all of my metadata living in Metaphor. I have constant updates feeding in through, and now I want to build other applications on top of that metadata graph that I've populated.
This is actually an area we spend a lot of thought in. Very early on, we realized the whole metadata thing is an integration game, right? The easier you make it for others to integrate, the more adoption you end up getting. So we really thought hard about how do we make this as easy as possible. Sure, on the one extreme, you can have, hey, everything is fully managed, which we do as well, right? Okay, all you have to do is enter your credential, your Snowflake credential, your whatever system credential, Looker credential and whatnot. Okay, we can go and connect to those systems and grab metadata for you on your behalf. And a lot of companies prefer that way because they want to have as little, thing to manage as possible, right? So they want it to be fully managed. But as soon as you start talking to larger companies, they get a little bit nervous about that. There's definitely security consideration. There's also consideration saying that, hey, look, we have our own custom system, right? For example, right? Or maybe this is a pipeline that we run inside. Maybe it's our CI/CD that is doing these things and all that. So you cannot fully manage this for us, right? It doesn't make any sense for you to fully manage this stuff for us. So how we as a company able to just push the metadata to you and then have you, ingest into your system and start surfacing up in your platform? So for that, yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned before, we do provide essentially like Python library and script that people can run against system that we support out of the box. But for systems that we do not support out of the box, it's also super easy for them to leverage the library to build something on their own. And literally what end up happening at the end of the day is for them to, extract the metadata from the system, whichever way they feel they deem easy for them to extract those metadata. At the end of the day, just write it to a file and put that file on S3 bucket or GCS or something like that, right? And then we'll pick it up from the other side. It'll be as easy as that. Everything will be automated. Everything is essentially near real time. As soon as the file is written, we'll ingest it. We try to make it as easy as that. So even if there's a system, proprietary system that they develop in-house that we have no access to, they can still easily integrate with us.
And so for people who are going down that path of integrating with Metaphor and building systems on top of it, what are some of the challenges that you've seen teams face in terms of being able to stitch together a meaningful set of relationships across these metadata entities where I've populated the database schema for my application database. I also have the, job IDs and task timings for my Airflow jobs that are landing in the data warehouse, and then being able to actually build a cohesive view of saying, okay, so this job is taking these source tables, landing it in this destination, and then triggering this DBT pipeline.
Yeah, actually, this is also a very super interesting area. We joke about how the hardest bit there is none of the code that you have to write. The hardest bit is actually to agree on the ID, right? Because you kind of have to have this global ID to say, when you say, hey, this is the job, this is the table, this is the column, you need to have a way of referring that. Right. And then everybody need to agree on that. Otherwise, things won't link up. It will be as easy as that. But then the tricky bit there is these ID generally is kind of hierarchical in nature, right? If you think about it, if you're talking about a table in Redshift, okay, you can say, sure, I can start with a table name. But then, of course, you say, hey, wait a second. You probably need to include a schema and database as well to make it globally unique. You say, okay, fine, I'll add those. But then the next step, you say, hey, look, what if you had more than one Redshift cluster? Right? Okay, then you have to add more than one. But wait a second, what if you deploy to multiple regions in AWS, right? At that point, you can see that there will be multiple layers of things that sort of uniquely identify this thing. But then at the same time, you cannot make it all mandatory, right? Because if you make all of that mandatory, guess what? Like people say, I only have one cluster in one region. Why should I fill out all these information that are not necessary? So coming up with an IDing system that is extendable, so you can cope with the most complicated system, right? Multi-region, multi-cluster sort of scenario. But at the same time, you won't burden the people who actually is the majority that doesn't have complicated deployment. How do you design an ID system that works in both cases? It's actually a very interesting engineering challenge. And then after all, once you develop that, if your ID system ever change, right? For example, okay, now I actually do have the second cluster. How do I make sure that this ID system can migrate? Is also yet in itself is another challenge as well. Those are super interesting engineering challenges that we face every day. And for better for worse, we have, as the team that provide the metadata platform, you kind of have to put some rules in place when it comes to this sort of thing. But you just want to make sure your rule is flexible enough so when people do actually have different configuration, and you don't force them always to be as fine-grained as they could possibly be, because that will be kind of counterintuitive in most cases.
For people who are starting to use Metaphor and explore its capabilities and build new systems that tie into it, what are some of the features or potential use cases that are either overlooked or misunderstood, and some of the things that you'd like to draw particular attention to for people who are considering Metaphor for their use case?
Another interesting question. So, I think we lightly touched upon this in the previous conversations, right? Like, not just Metaphor, like a lot of common misconception or misunderstanding around data catalogs was like the assumption that pulling all the technical data together is going to solve the data discovery problem is in itself is the problem to start with, right? So we have first-hand experience trying that out LinkedIn. There are limitations. That is definitely a first step towards solving the problem, a natural thought process that hey, I cannot find it because I don't have it all in one place, and it might be a search relevance problem, or let me just add as many signals including into one place. Right? It is in fact not a search relevance problem, right? It is really hard. Just use relevance to identify what you're looking for, right? That's why we believe catalog is a part of it, or to be very specific, technical metadata catalog is a part of the whole solution or the problem. But essentially, you need way different signals around how is your data, what is your organizational challenges and how you use the data, or what is the business context you are actually using this data for, or who is involved, and all these aspects come together to kind of like help you understand what is the right data for your use case, right? Like, or all the use cases what we talked about. That's why we believe that there are like three components: technical metadata and business metadata, and like actually the user metadata, usage like context, which we need to bring it together to kind of solve this problem holistically. And written a blog post around this, like, why can't I find the right data, which came out of like all the frustrations what we heard from our customers in the past, like in the last few years, and like what we are essentially trying to solve with Metaphor.
There's also a funny story I'll interject there as well. So in fact, we hear this multiple variation, right? When people say, hey, look, how do I know I can trust the data? Guess what? I'm not looking at the data quality. I'm not looking at the lineage. I'm not even looking at the SQL query or anything like that. I'm looking at who's using it, who's depending on it, and if I trust that person. Right? It might sound silly, but that's actually very true, right? Because if you think about it, a lot of time you will trust the person, right? If I know this dashboard is used by a CEO, I can trust it a lot, right? Because I know someone will make sure that it happens. It's up to date and it's accurate and all that, right? Whereas if it's not used by anyone at all, or not used by anyone I trust, naturally you have less trust towards it. That's part of it. But that's basically how this whole, behavior metadata as well as, business metadata come into play. So you cannot just throw all the technical stuff at the people and expect them able to magically digest all that and come up with their own enlightenment. I think that's not how it works in real life.
And as you have been building the business and working with customers and design partners, what are some of the, surprising aspects of the usage of metadata or the level of general sophistication or awareness of its capabilities, or some of the potential adjacent use cases that you might start to explore for this metadata platform?
I would rather say, like, I think I also mentioned this, like one of the surprising thing, two levels, right? One is the scale of the company, right? Like we were always thinking that this is like 1,000+ people kind of a problem, and we were only targeting and talking to those people. But a lot of inbounds happen to be like from like very small companies, like 100 people. And when we take a deeper look, yes, they do have same set of problems. This is a very interesting thing. And there is very pyramidal structure to the set of problems what they have. Like, yes, finding the data is one thing, but in terms of governance, there are like a lot of advanced use cases in terms of I use a DBT or like a kind of a thing to kind of like govern like the creation of the stuff. But once I have downstream dependencies and things, can I enforce rules on top of like my creation to make sure that those valid usage consumption patterns are validated, right? Like in the sense, if a dashboard user says that like this cannot drop this column, then that has to be part of your check, like git push check, to make sure that the consumption patterns are also like validated before you actually do the change, right? These are some of the things, and some of the interesting use cases which popped up around like ROI, not like which we always thought it's a cost problem, like or resource like billing problem, like huge bills and things, but it is not just that. Like a lot of opportunity cost for the data teams is huge, which is essentially like talking about like what's the ROI on my data, right? Yeah.
Recently, like both Snowflake and Databricks start pushing hard on their data marketplace, right? And we do hear people start talking about this sort of along that line, right? Hey, we're spending money buying these data. How do I know it's actually give us the ROI that we actually wanted to know, or we wanted to achieve, essentially, right? So that sort of question, if you don't know how the data was used, you cannot answer those questions, right? Maybe there's a dashboard that's powered by this data, but is this an important dashboard? Is it not? I mean, does that actually lead to important business decision or not? That sort of question, becomes very, very interesting as soon as companies really start spending a lot of money buying data from outside. They want to know whether there's an actual ROI, the right kind of ROI they want.
Conversely, for a lot of companies, this is not a problem like only internal, like with how do I enable data discovery within the company. But like if you think about it, do I need a separate data marketplace catalog, or can I just like leverage the same catalog with an external view versus an internal view and expose this data for like availability, or like try selling this data for my customers, right? Like this is an interesting ask coming towards us from our customers as well.
As you have been working with people and building out the platform, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or innovative ways that you've seen Metaphor used?
As part of our system, we actually stress a lot on knowledge capture to a great extent, right? Data relevant knowledge that we want people to capture. And these are actually being used in many different creative ways, right? Some people use it as a way of, hey, here's an onboarding guide, new team member, right? welcome to the team. Here are the 3 things that we use in terms of data. Here are the 5 dashboards you need to pay attention to. Oh, by the way, here are the 2 persons that you have to work with in the sister team that they happen to know much about this. Right, that sort of thing actually is a good way to document that in the context of the data, right? So our system happened to be very good at essentially, linking all these things in together in a nice, for lack of a better word, Notion-like sort of document, right? So having that ability, people start using it for like sort of onboarding guide. And of course, you can extend that to kind of wiki page as well, right? So some team create, hey, look, here's our team's wiki page. Here are the 5 things we work on mostly. And, if you have question about this, go and ask this team and all that. There's definitely that sort of piece as well. And finally, there's also like some people create essentially kind of my personal favorite playlist sort of thing, right? Basically say, hey, these are the 5 things that I work on a lot, or when I do this project, these are the 4 different things I use a lot. And then sort of share that across, right? Basically telling people, hey, look, if you happen to work on this project, here are the 5 things and 4 things you should pay attention to and all that. So those are kind of the creative way people are using the knowledge capture thing in order to surface all that information. The more expected way, for example, right? One thing that we hear from our users say, hey, look, I'm a data engineer, right? I'm in charge of the thing, and I need to deprecate the table, or I need to migrate it to something else. And yes, I look at the lineage, I realize there's 100 things that this thing depends on. It depends on this particular table, right? But I don't know if any of those are really useful or being critical, right? I can look at the access log and then say, yes, well, this headless account that's accessing every day, right? So what, right? I mean, because someone set up a pipeline, of course, there's going to be headless account accessing it. How do I know if this is actually business critical, right? And then you kind of have to rely on people telling you that. It's very hard to someone magically derive that. And in fact, most of the thing we hear is people just turn off access and see who cries, right? That's kind of the typical case. Let me turn it off for a couple of days and see what breaks. And if nothing breaks, then I can maybe kill it off at that point. And this actually happened inside LinkedIn before as well, where they turn it off 30 days, nothing happens, nothing breaks, all good. Turn it off, next day it breaks because there's a quarterly report that runs every quarter. and then that breaks, right? So, I mean, you can argue that if I extend it to a year, maybe that's okay. But at that point, maybe the migration's kind of point is muted at that point, right? So having the ability to know who's using it and using it for what purpose becomes super important when it comes to deprecation. And of course, they can always check with the person, hey, is this still true? Are you still using this and all that? And if the answer is no, then maybe it's safe to deprecate at that point. So there's that kind of the expected usage of knowledge capture, but then suddenly there's also a bunch of unexpected usage.
In terms of your own experience and lessons learned building Metaphor, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've come across?
I think we sort of covered that on that part. I think the whole modern data stack sort of just bring a lot of these problems to smaller companies a lot quicker than we have before. And I think, the sort of the underlying thing is more and more companies become more data driven, right? I think in certain industry, for example, e-commerce, now if you're not data driven, it's almost, you're not going to be able to compete with your competitor, right? Straight right out. So because of that, the nature of that, a lot of these problems that we thought, quote unquote, big company problem because we work at LinkedIn, right? And that sort of skill, yes, absolutely, you have that problem. When we come out and we talk to people, we realize, oh no, it's not true anymore because a lot of these small companies, they gain their superpowers through modern data stack and then now they're having all these problems. So that was definitely very surprising found for us because initially we thought, hey, we have to work with big enterprises, right? The banks, insurance company and all that in order to survive because only those are the companies that care about these things. And it turns out that's completely not true. Small companies actually care about these things a lot more.
For people who are trying to gain better visibility into their overall data ecosystem and data platforms that they're building, what are some of the cases where Metaphor is the wrong choice and they might be better suited by some in-house system that they've built or some other data catalog or whatever other sort of set of tooling that they might decide to cobble together?
I think we demystified company size is not really an indication. It is really about actually your data maturity, right? Stack maturity. To be more specific, if you have adopted modern data stack on the path for it, the earlier you engage with a modern metadata platform is more beneficial rather than introducing later into the game. And if you are anywhere far, we have also seen cases where they're not cloud native or they're nowhere close to a modern data stack, then maybe a traditional data catalog or an enterprise a catalog could be a better choice, an old school catalog.
I think the bottom line is we would strongly discourage anyone to build a catalog of their own. We've seen too many cases, too many companies try that because it might seem like an easy thing to do, right? I think no one other than a handful of companies actually building cloud data warehouse, but everybody seems to be building a catalog of their own. The reality of it is a lot more complicated, right? Like I mentioned before, sure, you can easily build a point solution, right? You easily throw some Flask that shows some static pages and call it a day. But your use case will evolve very quickly. You realize that it's not enough. And you throw more and more engineering hours into this, right? And if you have plenty of engineering hours, sure, feel free to do that. But I think most companies will treasure the engineering hour very dearly and try to work on something that is their core business. So we would definitely discourage people to do that. We've done that before. Not fun. And you will probably end up spending more in the longer term than you think you will.
And as you continue to build out the Metaphor platform and work with customers and grow the company, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term, or any projects that you're particularly excited to dig into?
Like we mentioned, definitely the mission of the company is to build the metadata platform, which can power like multiple use cases rather than like building these point-to-point solutions, right? Like, and data discovery and like parts of governance happen to be the very initial for towards that. And soon we are going to enable a lot more use cases around change management or resource optimizations, which are very exciting use cases on their own. And there's a different dimension. Some of our customers are also interested in extending these capabilities to like other assets like ML models and features in addition to the data sets and dashboards what we have. That's an interesting area which we will be working as well pretty soon.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Metaphor or the overall space of metadata platforms and its applications to the data ecosystem that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
No, I think we pretty much covered a lot of this thing. Like the only aspect, like, hey, you have so much of rich metadata with you. What are the insights you're going to drive, and like how much beyond automation, like how much predictive aspects can you build on top of it? Like, hey, looks like this change could affect you, or rather than like enabling only debugging or root cause analysis, like being intelligent about notifications or being intelligent about identifying a problem and helping out proactively to the customer. It's an interesting space as well, like as we start accumulating a lot of this important metadata.
And I think also the privacy angle of this is also, we recognize it's almost unavoidable. That is a big driving forces for a lot of company. You know, obviously GDPR, CCPA, and a whole bunch of other localized version of them is coming out everywhere. So we definitely hear a lot of those use cases as well. I don't think we will be getting into that in the short term per se, but I think the catalog does play a big part of that, at least as kind of a portal into how to control that sort of thing and whatnot. Not necessarily actually enforcing the compliance requirements, but definitely has a strong angle in sort of surfacing that information up to the user. So that is something that I think we will have to get into sooner or later. And just that right now our priority is mostly focusing on the discovery and governance piece.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're each doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
There's a very interesting blog post by Ben Stencil on data experience. I think there's a couple variation of it. There's data experience, there's data OS and all that. I think he summed it up pretty well in his blog. You know, we have great tools, no doubt. There's tons and tons of great tools that are very, very specialized and very, very good at what they're doing. But what's really lacking is a cohesive experience. And that is why data, despite being, hey, look, you know, we're trying to democratize and all that, still kind of being used mostly by technical people, right? Business people are still reasonably shying away from using it or just dabbling on the surface of it. So that is not true democratization, right? I think the true democratization is a place where, you know, data serves the main purpose, which is improving business, and business people are very happy to use data on a very regular basis. That is the piece that we think we are also trying to solve, and we have a good shot at solving it because of our sort of cross-cutting nature of the area we're in. So yeah, we're definitely hoping that we can bring out a product where, you know, not just that you have the best in breed of all these infra technology, but also the best in breed experience that enable everyone to truly democratize your platform. So
All right. Well, thank you both very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at Metaphor. It's definitely exciting to see another entrant to the space and something that is aiming to be a more broad-based application of metadata and its use throughout the overall data platform. So definitely appreciate the time and energy that you're each putting into that and excited to see where you take the business. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Tobias.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.